Sean Pendergast and I had Nick Caserio on the radio show on Friday, and he weighed in on a few of the things surrounding really mostly the trade up for Will Anderson and everything that encompassed, and also disclosed something that puts him in the same category or same grouping of super successful rapper Macklemore. Can I still say that? He was really successful for a while. But we'll share that as we go on. But I cut down some clips here because, as Nick gives a lot of information, so I cut this down to 8 or 9 clips, and we'll just start right in with him describing exactly how all of the trade from 12 up to 3 came to be, and when he figured out that it could actually happen.
The first round, you can't turn your pick in until there's 5 minutes on the clock. So even at 2, we're sitting there and saying, all right, we knew we were going to pick at 2, but we had to wait 5 minutes. So there's really nothing we can do about it because the league tells us, well, you got to wait 5 minutes until you turn the pick in, because TVs usually ends up being behind by about 56 picks. So they don't want the picks turned in and then the information gets out.
So Sean had asked him, hey, how'd you guys get your pick in so fast? And our theory was that you want to turn the screws on Arizona to be sure that they don't, have as much time to court offers from other people as possible.
So made the pick at 2, and then as soon as we turn the pick in, as soon as they announce it, then the third pick is on the clock. So in that case, Arizona was on the clock. So at that time when Arizona was on the clock, Monty reached out.
Monty Ossenfort's the GM of the Cardinals.
Out and said, hey, are you guys in? He said, look, we're talking about it. Where are you at? And Monty and I had put some general parameters in place going into the draft. We had discussions Thursday afternoon, so we kind of had some general parameters. And we were actually, I'd say some teams are inclined to maybe, well, would you do it before the draft? Some teams want to wait till they're on the clock.
So that was interesting too, because he'd had conversations, and that's been written about already, and he's talked about that. I think the big thing here that we got a sense for in talking to him about the mechanics of actually getting the trade in, because you recall it came right down to the wire, was that you pretty much had to have the deal in place, because there's not time for Arizona to be courting offers from other teams other than maybe Tennessee. And I think that makes me feel a little bit better about how aggressive they were. I'd be curious to know exactly how much they disclosed to Monty Ossenfort about who they were going for and all of that. But if the Titans wanted CJ Stroud, they were going to probably pretty much have to hammer that out beforehand, because, you saw how tight it got.
On the clock, they called. We had the parameters in place. We kind of went back and forth on some of the compensation, and we've talked about this previously about how trades work, the actual mechanics of it. So it's Houston to Arizona. Are we agreeing on the terms? Both teams have to call the league, and then the league has to make sure the terms match up. So you're really not on the clock until the league gives you the green light. So we were on the phone. The shot clock's running down here while we're on the phone with the league, and then they finally said, all right, you guys are on the clock with $1.30 or whatever it was. So while we were doing that, we all the picks are submitted electronically, so we had to make sure that we had it teed up, so as soon as we're on the clock we could hit send, and then it was hang the phone up with the league, get the player on the phone. So all that happened, I would say, fairly quickly. So I can't remember exactly where we ended up, but it was close to a minute or under a minute where we actually announced the picks. So, you just want to be organized. You want to be thoughtful, and, you just try to get in on the shot clock. You don't want to skip your turn and let somebody else jump in there. So we were able to get the trade executed, get to the end point, and then select the player. And then essentially the draft was over Thursday night, because we were basically out of the first round and essentially out of the second round there early on Friday.
Yeah, and that's the part that's really tricky there was I don't know if I don't know if when he was explaining it, he was saying that we're not on the clock until the league approves it, but no, they're on the clock, they just can't do anything about it. So the league has to approve all of this as you're presenting it to them. And I frankly, it feels like there should be an app or something like that, or they can throw this to Chat GPT or something to keep this from being such a cumbersome process, because there's only room there for them to have complex discussions with one team, which I guess helps the Texans out there, because once you go down the road as the Cardinals a certain amount of time, then like they're kind of bound to it. Like they can't be courting offers from Tennessee and put those in with enough time to get that approved. So I guess I don't know if that makes you feel better or worse about the compensation. I'm cool with the compensation, but if you're somebody that thinks, okay, who are they bidding against? Were they just bidding against themselves? They were bidding against the Titans. It's just that the process had to start early on. It had to start early before the actual draft began to be able to get everything in if it's going to be any kind of thing that involves multiple picks. I'm analytical, not very outgoing, just like Caserio, but God, I hope I don't come as awkward as Colts. Yeah. Hey, no, he's loosened up a lot. I think he's loosened up a whole lot. So then Sean Pendergast asked if having the second pick makes you more apt to trade up, or if they were more apt to trade up.
Thought there might be an opportunity for us, if it presented itself, to try to get two quality players sort of at the top of the draft. So there was
Sorry, if having the second pick made it more likely for him to trade up to number 3.
A handful of players as we went through, and if we said, look, there's an opportunity to maybe, if we could get 2 of them, is this something that we would consider? So if we were at 1, would that have precluded us from maybe doing something else? Not necessarily. I think part of that would have been, well, what compensation was remaining? What did we have left? So I think it was more geared towards, and we've talked about this on the show previously as well, trades are always really player driven. So it's about the player. And if you feel you have an opportunity to maybe get 2 players that you otherwise wouldn't, you should think about it and talk about it. So I would say that was the overarching theme and philosophy as we approached it and went into it.
Okay. So as far as him saying that trades are player driven, like honestly, sometimes I don't know where he's actually going with that. He's talked about that before, but I think there are a couple elements here. And, if you want to say it was a trade for CJ Stroud, really, because what they really wanted is Will Anderson, I can appreciate that, except that then you are also admitting as a team that you valued a position player way higher than a quarterback who you also thought was worth a number 3 overall pick. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that I want to believe that they believe. I think that they really loved Will Anderson. I think that there are a couple things at play where when people start talking about trade value and using the trade value charts at the very top of the draft, everything kind of breaks down. The economics kind of break down. And it just goes back to, like, honestly, prospect theory and all of these things that broke off from old economics. And the fact of the matter is, like, when people are trading outside of the top 10, especially, they're trading draft picks more like, it's currency. And the further you get away from the top picks, it's just currency. The same way you don't get emotionally attached to a $5 bill, you don't get attached to the 3rd pick in the 2nd round. When you get to those top picks, there's an attachment to those guys because you feel like they could make a big difference on your team. Do people get overly emotional about it? Certainly. And you hope that the Texans weren't overly emotional about it here. But the Julio Jones trade was a more expensive trade than this one. I think you could argue that the Julio Jones trade, I very rarely hear criticism of the Julio Jones trade. And I think part of that is less about Julio Jones and more so about the fact that the Falcons were competitive after they made it. And that's how people are going to judge this trade. It won't be judged by how good Will Anderson is, as long as he's good. As long as he's like above average, really good. He doesn't have to be JJ Watt good though. It'll be judged by how competitive the Texans are in the next few years. If he's JJ Watt caliber, but the Texans are awful, then it'll be an abysmal failure. We'll pick out the people that you could have traded for Will Anderson, and act like it was the dumbest thing ever. But the other part of it too, I think, is it's kind of like the old, was it a Dave Chappelle bit where he's talking about how, if you're going through divorce, if you've got $10 million and your spouse gets $5 million, you're still going to be all right. Where if you've got $20,000 and your spouse is going to get $10,000, things are a lot more serious. That there's an emotional component to, making some of these financial decisions. The fact of the matter is the Texans are in fine shape in the draft next year. So the risk hurts a little bit less because you've got that capital next year. You could also argue that that's, being frivolous or, reckless with your wealth. But there is a little less hazard because you're not, trading 2 picks for Laramie Tunsil and then having nothing on into the future. So I'm okay with it. I don't need to believe it was a trade for CJ Stroud to believe that the trade was worth it. I asked Nick Caserio if there was something special about Will Anderson, like kind of in the same way that I try to tell people, like, no, you guys don't understand. D'Amico is just like a different level of person. He's just like a different dude. There's a special charisma and way about him. And it feels like that's the same kind of stuff that I hear about Will Anderson. This is how Nick Caserio responded.
Has a lot of great traits, a lot of great qualities. He's a pretty unique individual, and I'd say, he and Bryce and a number of other folks, but especially this year down there, they probably really held the team together when they very easily could have gone a different way. They finished strong, after really back-to-back heartbreaking losses, Tennessee and LSU. Like, for all intent and purposes, your season's over, but they were committed to finishing strong, and they made a decision, which not sure how many players would have made this decision, both Bryce and Will and Gibbs as well, but to play in the bowl game against Kansas State. So I would say each player has their own unique qualities, but along the way, I think Will was very consistent with what he brings to the table, and he certainly earned his reputation with the work that he's done.
He got in really quickly. As I was saying, in the middle of that, we cut that up a little bit. In the middle of that, I said, I don't hold it against guys who don't go to the bowl game, Christian McCaffrey or guys like that. I mean, Nick Bosa kind of sat out that entire season of his when he didn't have to. But I do look at it as a check plus when a guy does choose to play in a bowl game and he doesn't need to. Like Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett played in the Texas Bowl when he was injured, which I thought was cool. Plus, also, I was doing color commentary on the local broadcast, so it was a lot nicer being able to talk about Myles Garrett during that bowl game. But I think that there's, like, with Myles Garrett, if you think, okay, like there's somebody that people wanted to say, he's too into dinosaurs and things off the football field, so he's not a serious enough football player. I think him playing in a bowl game that he didn't need to play in was a counteraction. It counteracts some of that negative stigma. So like that, I think it matters. And Nick was very quick to say, it doesn't bother me either. Because, you don't want to get out there as the reputation, just like with college coaches, of guys that aren't going to want like half your best prospects. But I think that's what is another part of Will Anderson that's going to have to be true and that they have to be correct about, is that he is such a good leader, such a good person, and with that, a good enough football player that he is kind of a culture changer or a culture setter. We got into CJ Stroud and his evaluation and what the Texans think of him.
To him in Indy, brought him into our building, and I'd say
talking about they talked to him at Indy and brought him into the building.
The more time you spend around him, you see he has a certain. Sometimes people think, well, if a player has an edge, it can necessarily be a bad thing. But he wants to compete. He wants to be really, really good. He holds himself to a high standard. And I would say you can just kind of feel that when you speak with him and talk to him. It's something you can't just read on a sheet of paper and someone says, well, this guy's a good leader, he's competitive and tough. Okay, that's great. But when you actually interact with someone, then you have a better idea. And then you're looking for a manifestation of that and how he portrays that to you. So I would say that was probably one of the things among others that really stood out about him.
So I think the big thing about Stroud was that there were these reports that, Michael Lombardi was one of them. We talked about it on here, that he was hard to coach or difficult as a personality or whatever it might be. And meanwhile, remember the Texans were getting flack for not going to the pro days because apparently the Panthers is sending 2,700 employees and every basically season ticket holder to the pro days was evidence that they actually really, really cared about learning about these guys. The Texans did their due diligence, obviously. And I think that, sometimes when it comes to a quarterback, especially, there's only a couple people that really, really matter in terms of getting to know him. I'd say the head coach, the quarterback's coach or coordinator, maybe the owner, depending on how they're going to do things. So I wasn't ever too worried about that. There's another part that Nick got into. I think right here he gets into this perception that he might be hard to coach, CJ Stroud.
Everybody that comes in the building, kind of starting from square one. So there's no starters in the spring. So everybody's going to go out there, going to earn their
Oh, I had asked if CJ Stroud would be a starter week 1.
role based on their performance. So everybody will get the same opportunity. I think we'll be able to get started Friday this weekend with the rookies, 20 players, kind of give them their first introduction. And really our job is to get them ready to go for phase 2 workouts. Tuesday, Monday is a big golf outing, so everybody's going to go out there and try to pretend they're a good golfer for the foundation event. But then Tuesday, once we get back on the field, the following week, like our rookies will go in this Friday, this weekend, this next weekend, and then they'll go into phase 2. So everybody's starting from square one. There's no starters. We're not talking in those terms. Everybody's going to get a lot of reps. Everybody's going to get equal opportunity, and then we'll evaluate it as we go and make the decision that we feel is best for the team and the organization.
Okay, I took that as that he's going to be the starter, and I'll say no more about it, just because he didn't flat out say no. He's going to have to earn his role. I did a thing the other night for Texas Children's Hospital where I interviewed Peyton and Eli Manning on stage. It's really cool. It was a lot of fun. But one of the things that Peyton offered up is we were talking about leadership. I'd asked him some questions about establishing leadership as a rookie. And I had gotten the sense beforehand he didn't want to take questions about this draft or anything. So I didn't ask him directly about CJ Stroud, but I asked him about establishing leadership when he was a rookie or when he went to Denver. And he offered up on his own that he thinks that CJ Stroud or any of these quarterbacks who are drafted high to start from day one immediately so they can step in and run the huddle to learn the offense to do all that stuff. And I don't know if that means day one from rookie mini camps, but I do think that you don't need to mess around the way that Deshaun Watson was messed around with in that first season. The biggest problem I have with it these days is that you have very little practice time. The 2-a-days aren't 2-a-days anymore. You've got a practice in the morning and a walkthrough in the afternoon. So if you're trying to get a guy reps with actual NFL receivers, starters, and because if you're not working with starters, that means you're working with backups, which on days where some of the starters are getting rest, you're actually working with third stringers who might not even be in the NFL and who don't know the offense. Like I think you want CJ Stroud in there immediately, unless he's a guy that, if it were Anthony Richardson, it might be different. But CJ Stroud he's been running an offense, a very, very good offense for 2 years. I think he's got a lot of the leadership stuff kind of down pat, and now it's just a matter of doing everything else.
Bobby's been great.
Okay, so there's a question about Bobby Slowik in the offense. Apparently, I didn't add in the second cut where he had talked about CJ Stroud supposedly being hard to coach, and he basically said, "Look, he's how did he phrase it exactly? Basically, it sounded like honestly that CJ's no punk, but maybe some NFL coaches are." That's how I chose to interpret it. But that some guys. I think that CJ Stroud, the way people have described it, is that CJ might push back, give a little pushback, or want to know why, or just not always just be like yes sir, yes sir, yes sir guy. And the way that a lot of people before the draft, and I think the way Caserio described it was like, yeah, if there's somebody that just doesn't bother you, then it's no big deal. And I know that, I think that's one thing that probably Belichick and Brady had. We saw with Brady and O'Brien. They'd get testy with each other. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you don't have a thin skin and as long as both guys are actually competent, the quarterback and the coach.
Great energy.
So this is Bobby Slowik, the offensive coordinator.
Great attitude, really loves football. And I think the one thing as a team that we've talked about, and it's applicable offensively as it is defensively, it's just about explosiveness and quickness. So offensive linemen running off the ball with quickness and urgency and intent and explosiveness. And D'Amico's talked about this defensively, the swarm mindset and the swarm mentality. But Bobby's office is actually right next to mine. So he's been great. I popped in there, periodically, asked him a few questions. So at this point, we're out there in phase 2. It's really more individualized because we're really focused on individual skills. Quarterbacks are throwing routes on air, receivers are running routes. There's some concept teaching that's going on the field, I would say, at a very controlled pace. But we have just a very, I would say, offensively, a good group of coaches. And I think one thing about Bobby, I mean, Bobby kind of oversees the whole thing and allows the coaches to coach. But Bobby has a good grasp. And it's funny, I was watching some some offensive cut-ups that they have in the system, and there's highlights in there from like, RG3. Some of the film looks a little bit granular. So they've built up quite a library of plays over time. So, Bobby's been great. He's got a great attitude. He's got great energy, has a really good sense and feel for what he wants to do offensively. So, we're excited about the opportunity in front of us.
So you could hear right there, by the way, that's his, he was in the car as we were doing the interview, and he was dropping his daughter off at school. That's where maybe for those of you to whom he sounded mechanical, maybe it was just because he was actually trying to abide by the traffic laws and everything. I always kind of hope that somehow, maybe because he's partially distracted by traffic, that we'll get something out of him. But if anything, I think it helps him keep the walls up, because he was in that he's in that hyper alert, don't want to get no crash stage. So as far as Bobby Slowik was in Washington with Shanahan when he was a youngster. I think his role was defensive quality assistant. He was working with the film back there. So he does go back to the RG3 days. And I think that's probably one really good thing is he's seen them integrate new young players like RG3 or Kirk Cousins over the first couple of years into an offense. And they figured out exactly how to use RG3's college experience to incorporate that into their offense. And it's one thing, too, that I think I heard Case Keenum talking about this on Texans All Access, was that, look, it's not like it's the same offense everywhere it goes. It's not like even Kyle Shanahan's offense is the same from place to place. You got to mold it around who your players are. And if you've got an athletic offensive line, you can run a lot of outside zone. You can do a lot of cool things there. If you've got an athletic quarterback, you can do more. If you've got one little speed demon like Tank Dell, you can use him in ways that, and do things that perhaps the 49ers right now can't do with all their receivers, and vice versa. So I'm getting more and more excited about Bobby Slowik the more I hear about him, and just that he seems like a genuinely really bright dude. What I hope is, and I saw a couple of you guys chattering about it, like hopefully Bobby Slowik is kind of like Vic Fangio, who was a genius coordinator but didn't quite have the same classic head coach personality, and it kept him from getting a job for a long time. Not that I would wish that. Look, they'll pay him. They'll pay him just fine. So, this is Nick talking about the prospects sitting out of the bowl games. This was cut up separately from this discussion, obviously.
Regardless of the situation or circumstance, if you like football and you like to compete and you show multiple examples of that, that speaks to really who you are as a person and a player. And to your point, I would say in our process, we don't hold it against the player. If he chooses not to play, no problem. That's his choice. Like, there's no reason to get bent out of shape. There might be certain circumstances surrounding that, and everybody's got to make their own individual decisions. So we respect that. But I would say when a player chooses something like that, it speaks to his competitiveness, his want to, and his love of football. So it's really one part of the equation. But when you put it all together and you start to see some patterns develop over time, it certainly speaks to you. Absolutely.
So I was trying to think of an analogy for that, because it's not a knock against you if you choose not to go to the bowl game, and yet it's really, really cool if you do. So, that's it's still, so it's a knock against you, right? I mean, it's not like everybody's staying even. You're really saying that this guy, if you've got two equal guys, you got two identical twins, and the film all looks the same, except it just turns out this one guy is way more into staying loyal to his teammates, even if it might harm him financially. I gotta go with twin A there, right? So, I mean, it's like if you're thinking about two different women to marry and one is into more things than the other, like, you're gonna go with the one that's more into. It's not a requirement. You didn't put it on your OK Cupid profile or anything, but it turns out that just one's a little freakier. Usually that's a good thing, unless the freakiness is rooted in some kind of a psychological insecurity that makes her, you know how that all goes. Okay, then I asked about the S2 processing test, the infamous S2 cognitiacy, where the ability of a quarterback to process things visually, or an athlete to process things visually, is tested. CJ Stroud's was remarkably lower than most of the other top quarterbacks in this class, particularly Bryce Young. Big point of conversation that I'm sure all of you are sick of hearing about. This is where Nick revealed that he and Macklemore the rapper have something in common in their SAT scores.
I've had the good fortune of being around some damn good football players that, had 10 and 11 test scores. So what does that tell you, right? And who actually had a very good understanding of football. So tests are tests. I would just say this. I was one of the worst standardized test taker in the history of the world. I'm probably going to embarrass myself, but I think I scored like under 1,000 on the SATs. Like literally, I was a horrendous test taker. I probably couldn't get into Cornell as a result of that, but I was horrible.
How good a football player were you?
I don't know. Just ask the people at John Carroll. I was probably marginal if you ask them.
Marginal.
But really, like a standardized test, sometimes it's a hard measurement. So, all right, it's a data point. You can't just put your head in the sand. You use it as a data point, and what it forces you to do is say, all right, let's do a little bit more digging. All right, let's try to get underneath the surface a little bit and see if there's actually something to this.
The thing about it is that people, and he referenced the Wonderlic on there too. I'm going to go over this ESPN article that also described the trade scenario and kind of go over some of the good and the bad of it. But the thing about the Wonderlic was that was like an old school, basically an IQ test. Well, or it was like a combination between the SATs and an IQ test, and it was. It kind of maybe set some low bar standards, especially for quarterbacks, but it was especially messed up when those got leaked because, a lot of those guys that got low Wonderlic scores basically have learning disabilities. So that gets out there and they've got their names dragged through the muds as being stupid or slow or what have you. And a lot of times it might be something that hurts them academically, but doesn't hurt them as a football player. And likewise with the S2 cognition test, there just isn't enough of a sample yet. And even when there is a big sample, like with any standardized test, it doesn't tell the whole story. Like I do really well on standardized tests. So I can say this with credibility. I'm not trying to make myself feel better about, having bad test scores or anything. I do really, really well on standardized tests. And I know for a fact, like at times I was judged to be a smarter football player and a better student than I actually was, because there's just like some good old fashioned horse sense that comes to playing football, where sometimes I was just like, I was kind of dumb when it came to like seeing the obvious, like it's just I overthought things sometimes. So I was dumb as a football player in a lot of ways. And in school, it doesn't measure any of those things like persistence or ability to stay on focus or anything. Like my ADHD actually helps me on standardized tests, I think, because I can focus like hell for like 2 minutes on one math problem and then move on to something else and focus like hell. So, but it doesn't tell me anything about like my ability to sustain an effort over time. Like as a student, if I don't have supervision, I'm awful at that. So like Nick saying that he got below 1,000 on his SATs, which is what Macklemore says in that 10,000 Hours songs, that he got a 980 on his SAT, which is, I feel like, I think the thing is with a GM, usually people probably figure a lot of those guys are math geniuses. And I'm still thinking, I wonder if Nick is one of those people, given what you guys have noticed about some of his personality, that he might be one of these guys that like got an 800 like an 800 math and like a 200 verbal or something. But I'm not worried about the S2 cognition test. If it goes on down the line, or the 20 years from now, they'll have more data and they'll be able to figure out more about it. Davis Mills went to Stanford or something. He knows he isn't the greatest football player. Well, you know what? And without taking shots at Davis Mills, I think that it's fair to say there were times when Davis Mills missed some easy reads. And I don't know how much of that was on him or on Pep Hamilton or Lovie Smith being overly conservative. But there were times, like a lot of times when you see somebody wide open in the end zone, you'd say, okay, yeah, but it wasn't even in one of his, the read that's not where his read would have been when the pass rush came clean. There were moments where it was clear and obvious. Like there was one read to make and Davis Mills double clutched and chose to go short. instead of going deep to Brandon Cooks, who was wide open in the end zone. And that is stuff that doesn't necessarily show up on an S2 cognition test. In the S2 cognition, it's not like ethnically biased the way a lot of other standardized tests are, at least from what I've heard. I mean, the three groups that score highest on it, I was told, are quarterbacks, cornerbacks, and safeties. So as far as, racial discrepancies or anything like that, it would seem that the two big race group, the two biggest racial groups in the NFL are black players and white players, and there at least seems to be some kind of equitability there. So let's see. Wonder what Butkus or Deacon would have scored. Well, as far as defensive linemen go, if anything, like honestly, like what I was just talking about earlier, sometimes with defensive linemen, the higher Wonderlic was actually looked at as a bad thing because most good defensive linemen are like, I should say on average, because if immediately you think of like, okay, JJ is an exception in a lot of ways. I think Aaron Donald is an exception. Those guys seem like they could be, very much scholar, and I think they both were very good scholar athletes, and a lot of guys are. But they worry about it the least with defensive line. We're just like we're almost just like zoo animals that they let perform for the tourists every now and then, and they throw some raw meat at night. I did really good on my SATs, but I graduated high school and college with an under 2.8. Yeah. I got a 0.3 my final semester at Cornell. And the only reason I got a 0.3 was because the Native American Studies professor liked me, so he gave me. I didn't go to class, not a single time. Don't do as I say, kids. Don't do as I do. Do as I say. Don't do as I do. But go to class every now and then. I want to go through this ESPN article that details, and it was written by like 4 different ESPN.com writers, but it details exactly what was going on with the Texans in this trade. Nick alluded to it in our interview that like some of the stuff reported afterwards might not be so accurate, but I think there's probably a kernel of the truth to some of this. But I think that the thing to keep in mind is that so many people assumed that the Texans were not going to take a quarterback. Like it had almost gotten in their brains, and they were angry at the Texans for not taking a quarterback before the draft had occurred, and the Texans had a chance to not take a quarterback. That afterwards, all their thinking was skewed by like some kind of cognitive dissonance where they didn't want to admit that they were wrong about the Texans not wanting to take a quarterback. So 2 hours before the NFL draft started last week, no one outside Houston knew what the Texans would do with the number 2 overall pick. Neither, as it turns out, did the Texans. This is what I couldn't quite nail down with Nick, but I don't know about the number 2 overall. So said the player who sparked the most excitement within the team's brain trust, especially first-year head coach DeMeco Ryans, was Anderson, the aforementioned Will Anderson. So this is where it gets interesting. And so basically they're saying they didn't know at this point whether they were going to take Will Anderson or CJ Stroud, which that's still – this is the thing that's keeping me from wanting to say that the trade up to 3 was actually like trading up for Stroud. But if you took Anderson second, you'd be able to, or if you took Stroud first, then you'd drive down the price of the third pick. It's just that doesn't make sense in terms of like the value of a quarterback. If you think that quarterback is worth the number 3 overall pick, then he's got to be way more valuable than a position player just because the upside is so great. A really good quarterback is bringing 4 to 8 wins extra per year for you on average. And a pass rusher just can't do that. But regardless, according to multiple sources, Anderson was the top-rated player on the Texans draft board for most of the offseason, ahead of Young, Stroud, and every other quarterback available. Ryans played at Alabama and consulted with Crimson Tide coach Nick Saban throughout the pre-draft process, according to a source. Ryans envisioned Anderson as the kind of game-changing edge rusher all great defenses have, similar to the one he had built. I cannot see that. Let me go to, let's do. He had built around his previous job as the San Francisco 49ers defensive coordinator, Nick Bosa. So I think this probably like lends a little credence. Sean Pendergast and I thought of this differently. That this lends a little credence to the theory that, that DeMeco really liked Will Anderson and maybe Nick Caserio felt they needed to take a quarterback. I'm not still buying that or believing that this is evidence of that. I do 100% see that DeMeco might. I think DeMeco might have, as a lot of defensive coaches do, kind of give the GM the reins when it comes to a quarterback, other than personality and things like that, leadership, all of that stuff. When it comes to judging the actual quarterback, I think a lot of defensive coaches really trust their GMs. So I think it would just work out that, okay, DeMeco really loves this defensive guy. That doesn't mean that's who they're definitely going to take. Texans haven't had a player produce a double-digit sack season since J.J. Watt in 2018. And other than quarterback, there's arguably no more position valuable in the modern NFL than pass rusher. And this is where I think if in your mind you want to believe that the Texans figured out a way to get a package of these two guys, a pass rusher on one side and a quarterback on the other, that's cool. Like, and especially given the mechanics of what we're about to see, the fact that they were able to pull it off in a year where, like, honestly, right around the 12th pick is where I felt like there really weren't a lot of genuine first round, like slam dunk first round in every draft types of guys. And that, like, there was a big chasm this year between the top 5 or 6 guys and everybody else. And there usually is some kind of chasm like that. But I think that for a team that needs to turn things around, it's time. They've cleared the deck. That the appeal of a stud on each side of the ball makes some sense, more so than even just emotional, but in terms of just starting to really establish some credibility within the building. So under those circumstances, some NFL owners would demand a quarterback. Texans chair and CEO Cal McNair isn't one of them. 2 days before the draft, Caserio told ESPN's Ed Werder that McNair had given him space to operate as he saw fit. And this is consistent from everybody we've heard from, everybody we've talked to so far. If I have time, I'm going to play some Bill Simmons that will drive you insane, because Bill Simmons just says stuff like it's a fact, just for the hell of it. So he's got his own little theory about how and why the Texans did things the way they did. But as I understand it, and I believe it, I don't think Cal told them anything. I think Cal wanted to give DeMeco an actual genuine chance to work with Nick Caserio, and wanted to give Caserio an actual chance to just flat out make their decision on it. That's why you pay. Look, if I'm gonna give guys 6-year contracts and pay them millions and millions of dollars on stuff like this, I'm not gonna go telling them which quarterback or which, to take a quarterback, unless it's that, look, I believe this is what Bob McNair did, starting with Osweiler, but it led to Deshaun Watson. He said, all right, let's go get a quarterback, but I'm not going to hold you. I'm not going to fire you if it doesn't work out the first go around. So first go around, it was Brock Osweiler, and it was a miserable failure, but he didn't fire anybody. He said, no, keep going for it. Keep going for it. So Rick Smith felt like he had the confidence and ability to trade up for Deshaun Watson, and that, for a while, worked out. Without COVID, who knows what the hell Deshaun, I don't know. Deshaun might have not gone into whatever weird massage habits he had if it weren't for, I'm not excusing any of the weird, but you know what I'm saying. So we're not going to go down those roads right now. So Caserio said the biggest thing is he's just been supportive of what we're doing. They've fully appreciated what we're trying to do, and they've enabled us the opportunity to kind of do what we feel is in the best interest of the organization. So Stroud was the next highest ranked quarterback after Young. Caserio said later in the post-draft news conference, he's a competitive player, has an edge about him in a good way, loves football, wants to compete, wants to be great. Good size, comes from a good program. Certainly has a long way to go. I think he'll admit that. That was interesting to me in the post-game press conference there. Nick just, came right out there and said, hey, we think he's got a long way to go. It wasn't like gushing that you've heard from so many people about either Bryce Young or the young guys they've drafted. And my gut tells me that that's just Nick Caserio being Nick Caserio and the way he talks about rookies, and that, he's been very consistent in that kind of New England mentality, which I like. I think you should always be reminding those guys, like, hey, listen, you haven't proven anything yet. So let's keep the nose to the grindstone. But that nobody's denied that Bryce Young, that I've seen, nobody with the Texans has denied that Bryce Young was their top guy. But if they're anything like me, I was cool and like easily convinced that Bryce Young's size is still going to be a concern moving forward. So I didn't like try to talk myself out of being okay with CJ Stroud. Neither Caserio nor Ryans could shake the idea of losing Anderson in the pursuit of a quarterback. Again, this is where I have a little bit of an issue here, but I'm still okay with the actual trade and the way everything went down. I've got a little bit of an issue with the fact that they're valuing an edge rusher as high as a quarterback they think is worth taking in the top 3. So in the days leading up to the draft, Caserio set out to see if he could move up high enough from number 12 to get both. And this is where it gets interesting. Well, for those who would criticize the Texans because they might say, well, who are they actually even bidding against? You know, other than the Titans who wanted CJ Stroud, but exactly when and where and how early they dropped out, it's not really clear. So were they just bidding against themselves? I think in effect, they kind of were, because when you listen to the mechanics of the trade, if you're just joining us on the live stream, you listen to Caserio describe the mechanics of the trade. There's not time to get into an all-out bidding war on something as complex as this once you go down the road a certain ways. So they had to have something that they felt was really competitive, which ends up being just shy of Julio Jones as far as non-quarterback draft compensation this century. It's behind Julio Jones. It's not as much as Trey Lance, but that was for a quarterback. And so there's you can argue this 8 different ways. So, okay. Oh, boy. I bit off a lot for myself to chew on this one. So buzz around the league. Remember how reliable buzz around the league is, centered around the Texans' apparent preference for Anderson. Caserio's time with the Patriots taught him the value of keeping his business secret, and only a handful of people knew he was working to move into the Cardinals' spot. In the days leading up to Thursday night, according to sources, people who had personal relationships with Caserio in Houston and New England tried to get an idea what he was up to. They couldn't. Stroud's agent, David Mulligata, I wonder if one of those is Michael Lombardi. I don't know. David Mulligata did not know that the Texans would target Stroud if they could make the trade, although Caserio did tell Werder that Mulligata's previous representation of Watson would have no effect on their decision. So, like, this is another one that's kind of fallen by the wayside, and things that we were right, wrong, or unsure about leading into the draft. I mean, I think there are 2 big things actually leading up to the hire of D'Amico and now this, that I'll give the Texans credit for, because I think a lot of people doubted this. I'm on record as saying I didn't think the lawsuit that D'Amico had filed when he was a player against the Texans was going to be a factor. So pat myself on the back for that one. I was wrong about a lot in this draft. Don't worry. I'm not being cocky sports radio host right now. I'm new age internet guy. But then there are also people that, flat out thought the Texans would never work with David Mulligata. I was unsure about it. At first I was adamant that there's no way they would let that be a barrier to trading a player they wanted. But then more and more you think about it, and then the more smoke that gets out there and you start wondering. I had my doubts. I wasn't certain, but I can't claim victory on this one. But I do think that, look, business is business, and sometimes you got to do work with people that you don't that you might not like, you don't appreciate, have screwed you over before. That's just the way it goes. So I did another one. Excuse me while I gaze into your guys' eyes. In reality, the Texans didn't know what was going to happen either. Austin Fort, the GM of the Cardinals, and the Cardinals drove a hard bargain, which is why the best guess from Texan sources Thursday afternoon was that Anderson would be the pick. But as the draft opened, Caserio was confident enough in the pending deal that he selected Stroud at number 2. Had he chosen Anderson first, the Cardinals might have gotten new offers at number 3 from teams seeking either Stroud or Richardson. But there was no wizardry involved, as he and Austin Fort agreed on the trade during the 10-minute allotment they had at number 3 to get the deal done. Caserio committed the second highest overpayment of draft capital. Let's do it this way. For a non-quarterback in the past 20 drafts, according to ESPN Analytics approximate value-based draft chart. I know a lot of other people say that a lot of draft charts don't look that bad or like it was an overpay. I think a lot of it comes down to, a lot of it just simply comes down to whether you're trading up for a quarterback or not. So and again, everything at the top gets kind of skewed based on how much you actually value that player. Some of you guys are making some really good comments. The only deal for a non-quarterback during the past 20 drafts to exceed the Texans deal was the move up from 27 to number 6 to select Julio Jones. The Falcons also gave up their first-round pick in 2012, 2 second-round picks, and a fourth-round pick. That was a pricey trade for a wide receiver, although I think that wide receivers are going to start getting kind of quarterback treatment, I think, in a lot of ways. But yeah, it was pricey. It was pricey, and yet I think you can't remove emotion from this. And I think that's where sometimes the people that want to be hard driving, analytically based thinkers with this, you gotta think about modern economics as opposed to your father's economics, where over the past 20, 30 years, they've started to understand and recognize that, like the psychological part of judging a deal and risk analysis and risk aversion and all of that. It's not right or wrong. It just matters. And I think it matters to a fan base as well. The Texans are in a position right now where, because they still have draft capital next year, they still have a normal looking draft next year, that this doesn't hurt as much as trading 2 future first round picks for a quarterback, say. Like, it's worth it when you trade 2 future first round picks for Deshaun Watson, and you don't have those, but at least you can say, all right, well, we were right on a quarterback. So I'm not sitting here saying that just, hey, if you got money, you got to spend it, but it does increase your appetite for risk. And I think that's okay. And especially too, I think that sometimes people forget this in general. You got to stop applying your own personal finances to the finances of an NFL team. And by that, I mean, as Brandon H., one of my favorite people on Twitter, big Texans fan, listener to our radio show. But Brandon H. responded to Sean Pendergast poll about whether, are we worried too much about draft compensation or compensation in that trade right now? Like, when Sean and I talk about it on the radio, a vast majority of people said either A, they don't care about it, or B, they'll worry about it next year. And in a pretty small minority, like 10% or so, said, yeah, the Texans paid way too much. That probably mirrors the amount of genuinely financially responsible people in the population at large, like the people that contribute 20% to their 401k and pay everything down all the time, and just understand, that's awesome that they are that way, or that you are that way. The thing you got to remember is NFL teams, these are trust funds. An NFL team is like a trust fund kid who, no matter how badly he fails, is still going to be just fine. So in this instance, especially, you whiff on being aggressive, you get back to square one. The GM gets fired. A bunch of your fan base gets pissed off, but they come back if that next stroke of aggression actually works out and pays out. And I've started to I used to be very conservative and think no, you got to make smart decisions for the long term all the time. Not if you're Johnny Manziel. Johnny Manziel in life is probably doing just fine financially, as long as his trust fund was actually as prodigious as people claimed it was. So that's what you're doing. So you get to start back from level every year in the NFL. Purely, if everything was even, you've got a 3% chance of winning a championship. Now, obviously, it's different based on who your quarterbacks are and everything, but those are the odds you're up against. To get into that lofty group of people that have a 10 or 15% winning a championship, you can make some gutsy moves, but you get back down to 3% pretty easily on average. Obviously, I know the Texans are way lower than 3% right now. Working on Twitter, former Philadelphia Eagles and Browns executive Joe Banner called the Texans trade last week one of the biggest overpayments of all time. I'll remind you that that's former Eagles executive, not current Howie Roseman. I feel like Howie Roseman would go for some things that Joe Banner wouldn't. Internally, the Texans settled Thursday on a more nuanced justification, according to sources. They considered the trade to be their cost for drafting a quarterback. Without it, they wouldn't have drafted Stroud and would have missed out on Richardson, Anderson, And Anderson would have been the pick. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a smokescreen. It was a frenzied conclusion of their efforts to find a different answer to the either or question. And again, too, I'm okay with the idea of it being a package deal, and it was kind of like that. Okay, if you want to try to get both these guys, then obviously you draft CJ Stroud first to reduce the appetite to trade up to number 3 overall from teams like the Titans, and I think that it still means that you traded up though for Anderson to do it. Like, so it means that they value Stroud as a number 3 overall pick as a quarterback, and yet they thought that a position player in Will Anderson was that much better than Stroud. And I'm just having a hard time with that because the upside of a really good quarterback is so much higher. Now, the other part of kind of risk analysis and everything is kind of like when you buy insurance, you pay a premium to feel good and safe and comfortable. Is Will Anderson that awesome of a dude that you just feel that good about him, that you feel like, okay, he's got a really high floor and he's going to be an awesome dude no matter what, but he's also got a really, really good chance of at the very least being an above average football player. And if you can develop him and use him in the scheme the right way, in a way really that's more aggressive as a defensive end than he was in college, then there's the upside, but you also do it as a package with Stroud. I'm just not going to think about the fact that they would have taken the position player over the quarterback, because ultimately maybe them taking Stroud is that part where they really don't think that Stroud is like quote unquote worth a top 3 pick, or maybe even Bryce Young, but that you do have to start taking swings at quarterbacks. Okay, I like that line of thinking better. You got to take swings at quarterbacks early and often, just like a venture capitalist. It's not going to work out most of the time, but you gotta keep swinging. And at one point, you do hit on that huge IPO, and there you go. And that's what hopefully we get lucky early on this one. Okay, that being said, the 2 factors that take the sting out of this for Houston: Will Anderson is a consensus elite prospect that plays a premier position. Kind of, again, like buying an insurance policy. You're going to pay a premium to feel safe about something. They did not pay as much as the 49ers did to move from 12 to 3 to select Trey Lance a few years ago. It was exorbitant. And I think that's what you have to take into account too, is aside from the draft capital the Texans already had in the future, aside from where they are as an organization right now, and maybe you want to make that big push. This is like Ray Kroc when he was first growing McDonald's. He did some unorthodox things. Like he maybe fibbed a little bit about the numbers. He did some things that could have really come back to bite him, and yet they were trying to create something great. And in the nascent period of something like that, you gotta take some chances, take some gambles. Okay, NFL. Okay, and this is the cautionary tale on the other side of it. Everybody, quit being boring about this. I've gotten way too nerdy about this, man. I've gotten way too. Yeah, guys, face it. We are going to be good this year. Yes, yes, Bubba. Yes, 100%. NFL teams. And I need some feedback real quick. I noticed that you guys are sticking around for me basically just reading an article. And I'm fascinated and excited about this because there's nothing I would like to do more than like take my daily show prep and just live stream it, where basically I'm reading articles and taking bullet points and everything. And if you guys actually have an appetite for something like this, I'm very, very cool with that. NFL teams are regularly overconfident in their ability to assess prospects, and the result is a trade market that punishes teams that trade up for non-quarterbacks. According to their draft calculations, Houston is surrendering the equivalent of a top 10 pick in extra value to make this selection. In fact, the picks this year would almost be enough to get fair value picks for picks 3 and 105. 105. I went like 114 or something. Oh no, you're giving up a Seth Payne. You're giving up a fat run stuffer. They don't even exist anymore. You got all these Quinnen Williams types. Okay, this is where I show that I'm definitely not a total stat nerd. Because I hear like, oh, okay, so it's like giving up this year's 12 and a number 10 pick next year. Like that's just one pick plus that 4th round. Whatever. I'm cool with that. Look, you gotta. If you feel this is where it needs to be. This is where their talent evaluation needs to be right. If you feel like Will Anderson is just that good of a bet, you put that up against the fact that a first round pick on average is about 50%, 50-50 going to make it as a long-term starter or stay on that team. Or think about even like fewer than 50% of the first round picks that were eligible this year had their fifth year options activated, I believe. Or it was right around 50%. So that's like, I hear that and I think, all right. The other thing too that annoys me a little bit is how many people feel like, oh, okay, well, the Texans are definitely going to be, the Texans gave up their pick, and that's definitely going to be number 1 or number 2 or number 3 overall. I put a graphic in here. I don't know if we're going to get to it, but basically shows that, like anything else in gambling, you're never favored against the field. You might be the favorite to get the number 1 overall pick next year, but the field has much better odds of doing it. Like it's rarely, or it's much less frequently the favorite that ends up being. It's just that he's like the favorite has the best chances of all of them, but all the other ones combined have a better chance of being that. So it's not so easy to be the worst team in the NFL. I've tried. So as Meltzer said, the question I have after reading this story is, if the Texans had the number 1 pick and drafted Bryce Young, would they have felt compelled to trade up for Will Anderson? It's a very, very good question, Mike Meltzer. From talking to Caserio and from reading that article, it feels like they would have tried to. The problem is that it would have been harder to perhaps jockey for position because other teams would have been doing it too. Now, okay, if Chicago is at number 2, would they have already traded for the Panthers, and what exactly? So I don't like, depending on what the scenario is, maybe if the Texans are at 1, the Panthers trade up to 2 and chose one of those 2 quarterbacks. Do the Texans then try to trade up to number 3? I get the sense that they would. I get the sense that they flat out really love Will Anderson. And I'm willing to learn to love Will Anderson too. I've so many people have said so many good things about him. The way I said things about D'Amico Ryans as a person and as a potential football coach, that I'm not discounting all of those people and what they've said to me. Oh yeah, you know what? I think I put this. Okay, so like if you look last year, this doesn't look awesome for the Texans, but I wanted to look at like the first, the top 5 worst teams by preseason odds in 2022. So the Texans were favored to be the worst. You look at the Bears are all the way up. They're tied for first, second, third, fourth, fifth, tied for 5th. And then out of these 8 teams right there, that were all tied in the top 3 worst teams for next season or for last season, only 2 ended up actually being there. Like it's harder to predict exactly who's going to be really bad next year. And like of those teams, 6 of those teams made it out of the cellar of those 8, and some of them actually showed a lot of promise. So it's never as bad or it's never as great as you feel it is. Damn it. Okay, so this real quick. Just want to throw this in here. First, I'm going to text my wife and ask if I've got like 7 more minutes to talk to you guys. Can I go for? She's trying to do her her daily meditation. Can I go for another 10 minutes? Heart, heart, heart. She's right in the next room, but I'm very, very loud. Okay, this is some of the idiocy of draft season before we get into Bill Simmons. So Arthur Smith said to Peter Skoronski, the offensive lineman who would eventually get drafted by the Titans. We'll see him. And I hate to stick up for a Titan here, but what the hell? Arthur Smith, who I think is a bright guy, Nepo baby, but bright. Arthur Smith said to Peter Skoronski during his visit with the Falcons, "You're really boring me right now. Your answers are so boring." And I read this article. This is in context as much as it needs to be. Skoronski added the whole meeting he kept looking at his computer, and he just said then he did say that you're just boring me. He wanted more juice out of him. This is the problem I have with every position except quarterback. This is what we've known. We've known this in psychology for decades upon decades. Of all the things that have been proven and then disproven in psychology, and there's a whole lot of messiness there, they know, they've proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that human beings do not act consistently from one environment to another. Like there's people that they are bold and brave in a battlefield environment, but then timid and shy in other environments. That's an extreme example, but leaders in one environment, not leaders in another. And like the fact that they're making these decisions on offensive and defensive linemen based on exactly whatever freaking head game they were playing with that guy there. I don't get it. They got to take some of the control away from some of these guys. And I thought Arthur Smith was supposed to be a good guy. Oh, she didn't say yes. She said, yeah. So I'm going to play some Bill Simmons real quick just to piss you all off before I go. Yeah is never as good as yes. Okay. So this is Peter Schrager talking with Bill Simmons on his podcast, and Bill Simmons, the way he does things, he always gets me pissed off. But here is Schrager mildly defending the Texans trade, and then Bill Simmons thrashing it.
Anderson's a 10-year starter, and the Texans are relevant next year, and they could put people in the building, and their defense is improved. Like, no one's going to be saying, I can't believe they gave up so much for Will Anderson. If they stink, and then that ends up being the pick for May or for Wilson, well, then, yeah, it's going to be a story that lingers forever.
You just threw two ifs with the Will Anderson trade, which is why it was a terrible trade. This is where, as usual, the VP of common sense could have stepped in. They clearly had the owner wanted the QB and the management wanted Will Anderson, and this was the compromise. Well, what if we trade up? It's just like my friend Lombardi was making the case like, no, if you look at it, what they traded for Arizona was really for CJ Stroud because the team wanted Will Anderson. It's like, no, I'm actually not going to look at it that way because they could have taken CJ Stroud at 2. And then they traded all that. They traded 12, 33, and a 24 first and third to Arizona. And the other thing is, we do this in the NBA. Like, why can't you top 5 protect the 24 first? Like, Houston's not going to be good. Newsflash. Guess who's not going to be good next year? The Houston Texans. Yeah. So that's the 7th pick in the draft, the 4th pick in the draft for Will Anderson, who we don't even, you just said, if he turns out to be an awesome 10-year starter, it's like, we don't know for a fact that he's going to turn into really anything.
Okay, we don't know for a fact that he's going to be anything, right? Yeah, that's the way the draft works. Okay, we don't know. We have no clue who's actually going to be good and who isn't. That speaks to a little bit of like that insurance policy. I do disagree with the one that I put up there that the comment that I put up there. We said that he's gonna have to be Lawrence Taylor to justify this trade. This is the way trades are judged. And this is the way people answer polls. When people are asked 3 years from now in a poll, was the Will Anderson trade worth it? They will not actually be answering that question. They will be answering, are the Texans a good team now? And then that will determine whether or not they answer that question as like, yes, the Will Anderson trade was good. Because like with Julio Jones, if the Falcons had not been competitive after the Julio Jones trade, people would have thought that was the dumbest trade in the history of Earth. There's the risk in it. The risk is that you make the trade, and the risk isn't whether or not the player is good. I mean, it partly is. The risk is in whether or not you get better as a football team. Because if the Texans are in the playoffs and pushing and they're contenders, people will write this as, oh, well, yes, it was clearly at the time. We all knew it was just an effort to stoke the fires on this team and get the juices flowing and set the right attitude. And thus it will be written. And the trade will have been worth it. If Will Anderson is JJ Watt, but they're not in the playoffs, then it'll be judged a bad trade. It's as simple as that. And that's where these decisions to trade up into the top 3 or to trade up into the top 5 cannot be judged by what happens in an efficient market. It's not an efficient market. It's not like the stock exchange or something like that. It just isn't. And like, you can't apply any set standard of rules to it. What it really comes down to is, are D'Amico and Nick good judges of exactly what Will Anderson is as a player, and do they make enough good ensuing decisions to justify it? The one other thing I'll say about that, where Bill Simmons like pissed me off, was when he said, clearly this is what happened. Like, clearly it was the like a compromise between the owner and the GM. What the hell are you talking about? Like, you're not even going to say you think that's what happened or anything. Like, that's clearly what happened. You know why? This is what happens. Because people like Bill Simmons, who loves to think he's like not the classic media guy, or he stands apart from all the nonsense. He believed all these fake reports about that the Texans weren't going to take a quarterback. So when you get duped like that, there's a cognitive dissonance where you don't want to admit that you were duped. You don't want to admit that you were an idiot. You don't want to admit you were a moron. So what do? You create up a new conspiracy. What's more likely? Okay, a bunch of people like Adam Schefter, like, framed opinions kind of like there were reports when they said, I think the Texans aren't going to take a quarterback. But then the Texans take a quarterback. Is it more likely that Schefter was wrong when he never actually even reported it? Or is it more likely that, he was right, but the owner was up to shenanigans, and they came up with some kind of weird compromise between an owner and a GM and a head coach to where they took all those guys? Like use your head. So what did he say? What did he say? Like at the beginning of that, the nonsense, use the nonsense flag or whatever it is. I say nonsense to you, Bill Simmons. Damn it. Put some bass in your voice next time.